Good morning, children. Welcome once again to Excel English with VKJ. I've come today to discuss the first lesson of your English course syllabus of Class 11 CBSE. Kindly refer to your textbook Hornbill. This is the first lesson of your Hornbill textbook, Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Begin with the lesson. Let us know a little about the author. All of you must have already heard about Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh was an Indian author, lawyer, diplomat, journalist, and politician. His experience in the 1947 partition of India inspired him to write The Train to Pakistan in 1956, which was later on made into a film in 1998. Born in Punjab, Khushwant Singh was educated in Modern School, New Delhi, St. Stephen's College, and graduated from Government College, Lahore. He earned an LLB from King's College, London. After working as a lawyer in Lahore High Court for 8 years, he joined the Indian Foreign Service upon the independence of India from the British Empire in 1947. He was appointed a journalist in the All India Radio in 1951 and then moved to the Department of Mass Communication of UNESCO at Paris in 1956. These last two careers encouraged him to pursue a literary career. As a writer, he was best known for his trenchant secularism, humor, sarcasm, and an abiding love of poetry. His comparisons of social and behavior characteristics of Westerners and Indians are laced with an acidic root. He served as the editor of several literary and news magazines, as well as two newspapers, through the 1970s and 1980s. Between 1980 to 1986, he served as a Member of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Parliament of India. Khushwant Singh was awarded with the Padma Bhushan in 1974. However, he returned the award in 1984 in protest against the Operation Blue Star, in which the Indian Army raided Amritsar. In 2007, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award in India. The lesson, The Portrait of a Lady, is a very interesting one. It describes a special bond between a grandmother and her grandson. Khushwant Singh narrates how the relationship develops over the years and changes as the grandson grows up and the grandmother grows older. Solitude and silence fill the grandmother's days as she distances herself from the real world. Children, we now begin with a line by line explanation of the text. Kindly open to the lesson The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh, page 3 of your Hornbill textbooks. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty, and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have had a wife and children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us about. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same age for the past 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in an inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Now, children, come to the first paragraph of the lesson. The author Khushwant Singh begins by describing his grandmother. He says, just like everybody else's grandmother, his grandmother was also an old woman. She was old and wrinkled for the past 20 years that he has been seeing her. People told him that once his grandmother was young and pretty and had a husband, but that was very difficult for Khushwant Singh to believe. And he had always seen his grandfather in the form of a portrait hanging above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. In the portrait, his grandfather was wearing a big turban and loose fitting clothes. He had a long white beard which covered almost his entire chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. So, seeing his grandfather's portrait, Khushwant Singh felt that this man could never have a wife and children, he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. And as for the thought of his grandmother being young and pretty, this thought was almost unbelievable for him. Almost revolting means almost unbelievable. And when the grandmother told him stories about the game she used to play in her childhood, it seemed quite ridiculous and undignified, for indecent, for a grandmother to play games. And that is why he treated them like those stories or the fables of the prophets which she used to tell him. In the second paragraph, Khushwant Singh continues to give a physical description of his grandmother. He says that she was short and fat and slightly bent, her face was full of wrinkles, and she looked extremely old for the past 20 years that he has been seeing her. She did not grow any older, that means she looked the same old for the past 20 years. Though she could never be pretty, according to him, but he always found her beautiful. She hobbled around the house in spotless white clothes, and to balance her walk, she rested one hand on her waist, and the other hand she had the beads of a rosary. She had white silvery hair scattered all over her puckered face. Puckered means wrinkled face. And her lips were constantly moving in a prayer which could not be heard by anybody else. Khushwant Singh reiterates the fact and says that yes, his grandmother was indeed beautiful. And to explain her beauty, he makes a wonderful comparison here. He compares her beauty to the beautiful winter landscape of the mountains. If you have been to the mountains in the winter, you must have seen that the mountains are covered with ice. So, just like the beauty of the snow capped mountains, his grandmother looked beautiful in her white clothes and in her white hair. He continues to appreciate her beauty by saying that she was a symbol of pure white serenity. Serenity means calm and peace. She breathed out peace and contentment. So, overall, how does he explain her beauty? He says that she looked like the beautiful snow capped mountains in the winter season, and she was a symbol of peace and contentment.
My mother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch me a wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen inkpot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dog. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayers in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scripture. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. Khushwant Singh, along with his grandmother, lived in the village while his parents were away in the city. So he had constantly lived with his grandmother for a long period of time in his childhood. So every morning, his grandmother would wake him up and get him ready for school. And while getting him ready for school, while bathing him and dressing him up, she would keep saying her morning prayers. She hoped that by hearing the prayers, he would pick them up. He listened to her voice because he loved her voice, but he never actually bothered to learn those prayers. Then the grandmother would fetch his wooden slate which she had already cleaned. She would tie them up in a bundle, the slate, the chalk, the earthen ink pot, and a red pen. And after giving him a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar on it, they would start for school. She also carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. Khushwant Singh's grandmother always accompanied him to school because the school was attached to the temple. While the priest used to teach the alphabet and the morning prayer to the children, the grandmother used to sit in the veranda inside and read her holy scriptures. And once his classes were over, both of them would walk back home. This time the village dogs would keep following them because the grandmother would offer them the stale chapatis which she had carried with them for the village dogs. Parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little themes of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc., etc. This made her unhappy. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. One day I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had rude associations. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars, and not meant for gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me after that. Now, once Khushwant Singh's parents had settled comfortably in the city, they called the grandmother and Khushwant Singh to the city. This brought a turning point in the friendship between the grandson and the grandmother. Though in the city they shared the same room, but his grandmother no longer accompanied him to school because he went to school in a bus. And there were no dogs in the street, so she started feeding the sparrows in the courtyard of the city house. And as the years started rolling by, Kushwant Singh and his grandmother saw less of each other. Though for some time she continued in the habit of waking him up and getting him ready for school. And when he used to come back from school, she used to ask him what lessons were taught. But she was not very happy when Khushwant Singh told her that he was taught English, he was taught Western science, and different scientific theories like the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. All this did not make her happy at all. One reason was because she could not help him anymore with his lessons. And secondly, she did not believe in the things that were taught in the school. She was very upset that in his new school there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. And one fine day, when Khushwant Singh told her that he was being given music lessons in school, she was very, very disturbed. Because for her, she believed that music had very indecent associations. It was not sung by, music was not for the gentlefolk, it was not for the decent people. She believed that it was for harlots and beggars and indecent people who tried to earn a living through music. But she said nothing. But Kushwant Singh knew that her silence meant disapproval. After that, she hardly spoke to her grandson. Up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her spinning wheel and recited prayers. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. While she sat in the veranda breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirping. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some even sat on her head. She smiled, but never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half an hour of the day for her. When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure my grandmother would be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and at her age one could never tell. But my grandmother could. She was not even sentimental. She came to leave me at the railway station, but did not talk or show any emotion. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of a rosary. Silently, she kissed my forehead, and when I left, I cherished the moist imprint as perhaps the last sign of physical contact between us. As the years passed by, Khushwant Singh reached the university level and was now given a separate room of his own. From now onwards, the common link of friendship, which was the sharing of a common room, was snapped between them. But his grandmother accepted this seclusion with resignation. That means she accepted this loneliness gracefully. Now she occupied herself by spinning the wheel and reciting her prayers. So from morning to evening she would sit by the wheel and keep spinning and reciting her prayers. Only in the afternoon she used to take half an hour to relax. And how did she relax? She used to feed the sparrows. She used to break the bread into small crumbs and throw it around, and hundreds of sparrows would come to have those pieces of bits of bread, and they all collected around her. Some even perched on her legs, her shoulders, and even on her head. She used to smile at them, but she never drove them away. That half an hour feeding the sparrows was the happiest half an hour for her. Now, there are two important phrases in bold in this paragraph. One is accepted her seclusion with resignation. That means she very gracefully accepted the loneliness in her life. The next one is a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. That means a real noisy confusion. There was a noisy confusion with the sparrows chirruping all around her. Then, when Khushwant Singh, after his university education, decided to go abroad for further studies, he thought that his grandmother would be very upset because he was leaving the country for 5 years. But his grandmother was not sentimental. She accepted this too. She even came to see him off at the station. She did not show or reveal any of her emotions. Her lips were moving in prayer, her mind was lost in prayer, and she was busy telling the beads of a rosary. Only before departing she silently kissed his forehead. Later on, Khushwant Singh cherished this memory of his grandmother kissing him on the forehead. He says that he always cherished the moist, wet impression of her lips on his forehead because that was perhaps the last physical contact between him and his grandmother. In the previous paragraph, Khushwant Singh says that he thought his grandmother would be very upset when he was leaving for abroad and he would be away from 5 years, and at her age one could never tell. That means she was so old that one could never tell whether she would survive by the time he returns from abroad. Now he says, but that was not so. After 5 years I came back home and was met by her at the station. She did not look a day older. She still had no time for words, and while she clasped me in her arms, I could hear her reciting her prayers. Even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows, whom she fed longer and with soulless rivulets. In the evening, a change came over her. She did not pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started to sing. For several hours she thumped the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum and sang of the homecoming of war. We had to persuade her to stop to avoid overstraining. That was the first time since I had known her that she did not play. The next morning she was taken ill. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told us that it would go. But my grandmother thought differently. She told us that her end was near. She said that since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life she had omitted to pray, she was not going to waste any more time talking to us. We protested, but she ignored our protests. She lay peacefully in bed, praying and telling her beads. Even before we could suspect, her lips stopped moving, and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and we knew that she was dead. So, contrary to his expectations, when Khushwant Singh came back to India after 5 long years, he found his grandmother waiting to welcome him at the railway station. And he was even more surprised to see that she did not look a day older. She looked the same. She still had no time for words. She clasped him, she embraced him in his arms, but then she was reciting her prayers even at that time. So the day Khushwant Singh arrived home were the happiest moments for her because she fed the sparrows for a longer time and with some frivolous rebuke, that means light scolding and smiles. In the evening, there was a change in her. She stopped praying. What she did was, she called the neighborhood women, she got an old drum and she started singing. For hours together, she was thumping, she was banging on the sagging skins of the old drum. It was a spoiled and an old drum. The skins of the drum were sagging. But she kept beating on those drums and singing. And what was the song she sang? She sang songs of the homecoming of warriors. We had to persuade her, request her to stop because it was straining her. But then she did not obey them at all. That was the first time Khushwant Singh had seen her not praying. The next morning she fell ill. She was suffering from mild fever, but the doctor said that she would get cured. But the grandmother had the intuition. She thought in a different way. She told them that her end was nearing, and because in the last day she had not prayed, she would not waste her time any more talking to them. They tried to stop her from it, but she never listened to them. She ignored their protests, and she lay peacefully on the bed and kept reciting prayers and telling her beads. And even before we could suspect, we could understand, even before they could understand, her lips stopped moving, and the rosary fell from her. What does it mean? That she was dead. So there was a peaceful pallor spread on her face. There was a paleness on her face which indicated her death. But then she was a symbol of peace, and we knew that she was no more. He lifted her off the bed, and as is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with the red shroud. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangements for her funeral. In the evening, we went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated. The sun was setting and had lit her room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. We stopped halfway in the courtyard. All over the veranda and in her room, right up to where she lay dead and stiff, wrapped in the red shroud, thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. There was no chirruping. We felt sorry for the birds, and my mother fetched some bread for them. She broke it into little crumbs the way my grandmother used to, and threw it to them. The sparrows took no notice of the bread. When we carried my grandmother's corpse off, they flew away proud. Next morning, the sweeper swept the bread crumbs into the dustbin. So once they realized that she was no more, they lifted her from the bed and, as is customary in Indians, laid her on the ground and covered her with a red sheet. After a few hours of mourning beside her, they left her alone. They left her body alone in the room, and they started making arrangements for the funeral. After all the arrangements were made in the evening, they came back to the room with a stretcher to carry her to be cremated. It was the time of sunset, and the setting light of the sun filled her room and her veranda with a golden light. They stopped halfway into the courtyard because they were so surprised to see that as the grandmother lay dead and still wrapped in the red sheet on the floor, there were thousands and thousands of sparrows all scattered on the floor. But what was surprising, what was astonishing was there was no chirruping at all. His mother felt sorry for the birds and brought some breadcrumbs and scattered it for them. But it was all the more shocking and surprising to see that the sparrows did not even take any notice of the breadcrumbs. And when they carried his grandmother's body off, the sparrows quietly flew away. Next morning, the sweeper came and swept the breadcrumbs into the dust. So the grandmother had developed a silent but a beautiful relationship with the sparrows too. And on her death, the sparrows came to mourn by her side. They did not come for the breadcrumbs. They came to bid her farewell. Now, children, you must have observed that there are certain phrases which are in bold in the lesson. Let us once again understand the meaning of these phrases which are written in bold. If you open to page 4, in the first paragraph, there is a phrase, the thought was almost revolting. Almost revolting means almost unbelievable. And what was the thought? The thought that his grandmother was once upon a time young and pretty. Because Khushwant Singh, from his childhood days, had seen his grandmother very old and wrinkled, he could not believe that his grandmother was once upon a time young and pretty. So the thought was almost revolting means the thought was almost unbelievable for him. The second expression is on page 4, first paragraph, an expanse of pure white serenity. This is where he compares his grandmother's beauty to the beauty of a winter mountain landscape. Just like in winter, the landscape of the mountains is very pretty with the snow spread all over. Similarly, she looked like an expanse of pure white symbol of purity and calmness. The third phrase is on the same page, page 4, second last paragraph. That was a turning point. Now, what was the turning point in the life of Khushwant Singh and his grandmother? The turning point is when Khushwant Singh and his grandmother were called over to the city by his parents. And once they came to the city, there was a change, there was a turning point in their relationship, in their equation. Because now she did not accompany him to school, nor did she help him with his lessons. So there was a change in their relationship at this time. We come to page 5, second paragraph. Though I have already explained these two to you. Accepted her seclusion with resignation. Once Khushwant Singh went up to the university level, because he was a grown-up young man, he was given a separate room of his own, and the common thing between both of them was the room they shared. So the common link between the grandmother and the grandson was broken when he was given a separate room. But the grandmother, she was a very composed old lady. She accepted her loneliness, she accepted her seclusion very gracefully. With resignation means with grace, without any complaints. Then on the same paragraph, you have a veritable bedlam of chirpings. What is it? In the afternoon, for half an hour, the grandmother used to feed the sparrows, and the sparrows, thousands of sparrows, used to collect all around her, some perching on her legs, on her shoulders, even on her head. And she only used to smile but never shooed them away. These sparrows, hundreds of sparrows at a time, they used to make a noisy confusion with their chirpings. So the veritable bedlam of chirping is the real noisy confusion created by the sound of the sparrows. Then we come to the same page, second last paragraph, frivolous rebukes. That is, when Khushwant Singh came back to India, came back to his country and to his home after 5 years of studying abroad, on that day the grandmother was so happy that she stopped saying her prayers and she was she fed the sparrows for an extra time, for longer than half an hour. She was so happy she was feeding them with frivolous rebukes. That means with light scoldings and smiles, and with the happiness around her, she was feeding the sparrows. Then the next one you have in the last paragraph, the sagging skins of the dilapidated drums. So if you remember, I had told you that the grandmother, she collected the neighborhood women. She arranged for an old drum. The drum was such an old one that the skin of the drum was sagging, was hanging down. It was spoiled. It was an old and a dilapidated drum, a very old drum. But she took that old drum and she beat on the sagging skins of the dilapidated drums. That means she was beating the drums which were very old and the skin of which was spoiled and hanging loose. Children, please look at the end of page 6, understanding the text. There are 5 questions given to you here. If you make notes to these questions, you will have a better understanding of the lesson. The first one, the 3 phases of the author's relationship with his grandmother before he left the country to study abroad. Now, there were 3 phases in his relationship with his grandmother before leaving for abroad. So the first phase is the village days, his earliest years, where he was very intimate with his grandmother because they lived in the same house together alone without anybody else. She used to do his daily chores. She used to wake him up, get him ready for school, bathe him, take his slate and writing materials together, accompany him to school, sit with him in the school, and bring him back. So that was the first phase, the most intimate phase of their relationship. The second phase is when they shifted to the city. The intimacy of their relationship decreased now because he went to an English medium school in the city in a bus and the grandmother did not have to accompany him. He started learning Western education. He was taught about scientific theories, he was taught about music, all of which she did not approve. So she started alienating herself from him and she spent her time in spinning the wheel and feeding the sparrows. We next come to the third phase. The third phase is when Khushwant Singh reached the university level. Now that he was a young adult, he was given a separate room. So the common link of friendship between them was the common room they shared. Now he had a separate room. So there was a physical separation too between them. But what is to be understood here is, though they lived in separate rooms now, their relationship was rock solid. Though it did not have any outwardly frills and show of emotions and expressions, the relationship was a very strong one. And that is why, when he was leaving for abroad, she came to see him off in the station. And when he returned after 5 years, she was once again in the station to receive him. And out of happiness, she spent the whole day singing songs about the homecoming abroad. So the first phase was the village life. The second phase was when they shifted to the city but still shared the common room in his school days. And the third phase was when he went up to the university and he was given a separate room of his own. The next question, 3 reasons why the author's grandmother was disturbed when she started going to the city school. Now, you remember that the grandmother was very unhappy with the lessons that he was being taught in school. He was being taught the rudiments of science, which disturbed her very much because she felt that the school was not teaching anything about religion and scriptures. That was not acceptable for her. So, number one, the reason was he was being taught science and English. Second was the absence of holy scriptures and its study. And third was her strong disapproval to learning music in school because she considered music to be of an indecent level. So these are the three reasons. Question number three. Three ways in which the author's grandmother spent her days after he grew up. Now, when he reached the city and started going to an English medium school, she did not have to accompany him to school. She did not have to help him with his lessons. So, what did the grandmother do? From sunrise to sunset, number one, she kept spinning the wheel and reciting prayers along with it. Number two is she relaxed by feeding the sparrows with crumbs of bread. And number three, she counted the beads of her rosary all the time. So these are the three ways in which she spent her time after Khushwant Singh grew up and got busy with his studies. Question number four. The odd way in which the author's grandmother behaved just before she died. Now, when Khushwant Singh returned from abroad after 5 years, she was so happy that she did not recite her prayers that day. She spent an extra time feeding the sparrows and then she called the neighborhood women and she started playing the drums and singing songs about the homecoming of soldiers. But the next morning, the day she died, she was laid down with fever. The doctor said that she would get cured, but the grandmother very oddly insisted that her end was near. So, in spite of her family protesting, she took to praying. She said that she would like to spend the last hours of her life in praying instead of talking to the family members. So, despite the protest, she lay down in bed, praying and telling her peace. Question number five. The way in which the sparrows expressed their sorrow when the author's grandmother died. Now, this is something really exemplary. The grandmother in the city spent half an hour each day feeding the sparrows. That was the happiest time of her day. She was very happy feeding the sparrows. The day she died and her body was brought off the bed and put on the floor and covered with a red shroud, the family members and Khushwant Singh too was astonished to see that there were hundreds and thousands of sparrows crowding the veranda and the grandmother's room right up to her body. But surprisingly, there was silence. There was no chirruping of the birds at all, which is extremely unnatural. And when the author's mother broke some breadcrumbs for them, they did not even look at the breadcrumbs because they had not come to have breadcrumbs that day. They had come to bid farewell to the grandmother. And when the corpse was carried away, they too flew away without having the breadcrumbs. Please answer the five questions that have been discussed with you in the previous slide. If you write them down, you will remember them better. So please do write. Thanks for watching. This is Mrs. Viki Jayashree from Excel English with VKJ. If you like my video, kindly like, share and subscribe. Please do subscribe. Thank you.